There are some memories you spend your entire life trying to protect because you believe they are the last pieces of someone you lost. For me, that person was my older sister, Natalie. She disappeared 22 years ago, and for most of my adult life, I carried the same painful explanation everyone else had accepted. Natalie had left. She had chosen another life. She had abandoned our family because she supposedly wanted freedom from the responsibilities that came with being a wife, a daughter, and a mother. I hated believing that explanation, especially because she had a baby daughter at the time. But after enough years, even the most painful explanation can begin to feel like the truth. What I didn't know was that the story I had been given was built on a lie.
My name is Victoria Bennett, and when Natalie disappeared, I was 24 years old. She was 28, married, and the mother of a little girl named Amelia, who was barely 6 months old. Natalie had always been the stronger personality between us. While I was cautious and constantly worried about what other people thought, she was outspoken, independent, and unwilling to pretend she agreed with people simply to keep the peace. She had a habit of asking uncomfortable questions, especially when she believed someone was being dishonest. At the time, I admired that about her. Years later, I would realize that it may have been exactly what put her in danger.
Our childhood had been relatively ordinary. We grew up in a quiet town where everyone seemed to know everyone's business, and our parents were considered respectable members of the community. Our father, Richard Bennett, owned a small construction company, while our mother, Margaret, worked at the local library. From the outside, our family looked stable and happy. Inside our house, however, there were subjects nobody discussed. Our father could become strangely silent whenever certain relatives visited. Our mother had a habit of changing the subject whenever Natalie asked about our grandparents. There were old disagreements buried beneath our family's polite conversations, but as children, we didn't understand them. Natalie started asking questions as she got older. She wanted to know why our father refused to speak about his older brother. She wanted to know why an old photograph of our grandparents had been removed from the living room. She wanted to know why our mother became visibly uncomfortable whenever someone mentioned the family property outside town. I remember telling her once that she should stop digging into things that didn't concern her. She laughed and told me that secrets only become dangerous when people spend too much energy protecting them. At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. Looking back now, I realize she may have been warning herself as much as she was warning me. Natalie married a man named Jonathan when she was 26. At first, our family welcomed him. He was polite, successful, and extremely charming around our parents. He knew exactly what to say to make people comfortable around him. But Natalie slowly became uncomfortable with him. She never directly accused him of anything serious, but she told me several times that she felt he was hiding parts of his life from her. She had discovered inconsistencies in stories he told about his childhood, his finances, and his relationship with certain people in town. Whenever she questioned him, he became defensive. I remember telling her that every marriage had disagreements, and that she shouldn't assume the worst simply because Jonathan didn't like being questioned. Then Amelia was born. For a while, the birth of her daughter seemed to settle everything. Natalie became completely devoted to Amelia. She sent me photographs almost every day and called me whenever the baby did something new. I remember visiting their house one Sunday afternoon and watching Natalie hold Amelia against her chest while she talked about the future. She told me she wanted to leave town eventually. She said she wanted to raise Amelia somewhere nobody knew our family's history. At the time, I assumed she was simply frustrated with our parents and the constant pressure surrounding her marriage. I didn't understand that she might have been trying to escape something much more serious. 3 weeks before she disappeared, Natalie called me late at night. Her voice sounded different. She was frightened, but she was trying very hard not to let me hear it. She told me she had discovered something about our family that she believed our parents had been hiding from us for years. I asked her what it was, but she refused to explain over the phone. She said she had documents and photographs that she needed to show me in person. She promised that she would come to my apartment the following Saturday and tell me everything. Before we ended the call, she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would never believe the first story people told me. I didn't understand why she said that. I wish I had asked more questions. She never arrived. On Friday morning, Natalie disappeared. Jonathan claimed she had left the house after an argument and never returned. He said she had taken some clothes, a small amount of cash, and her identification. Amelia was still at home. Natalie's car was still parked outside. Her wedding ring was still on the kitchen counter. Yet somehow, the police accepted the possibility that she had deliberately left. Our parents were devastated, but there was one thing they kept repeating. They told everyone that Natalie had always been restless and unhappy. They suggested that she had probably decided she wanted a new life and didn't know how to tell anyone. I couldn't accept that explanation at first. Natalie would never leave Amelia voluntarily. She wouldn't disappear without taking her daughter. But there was no evidence proving otherwise. The investigation eventually went cold. Years passed. Jonathan eventually moved away with Amelia. My parents died without ever giving me the answers I wanted. The family house was sold, the old belongings were divided, and Natalie's name slowly became something people mentioned less frequently. I refused to let myself forget her, but eventually I stopped expecting answers. I built my own career, got married, had children, and moved to another city. Life continued, even though a part of me always remained stuck on that Friday morning when my sister disappeared. Then, 22 years later, a young woman walked into my office. I was preparing for an important meeting when my assistant told me someone was waiting outside and insisted that she speak with me personally. I expected a client or perhaps an employee with an urgent problem. Instead, a woman in her early 20s entered, carrying an old brown envelope. She looked nervous, but there was something strangely familiar about her face. She introduced herself as Amelia. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I hadn't seen her since she was a baby. Amelia sat across from me and carefully placed the envelope on my desk. Her hands were trembling as she explained that she had recently discovered something about her mother. She told me that for most of her life, she had been given the same story I had been given. Natalie had abandoned her. Natalie had left because she supposedly didn't want to be a mother anymore. But Amelia no longer believed that story. She had found a hidden compartment inside an old piece of furniture that had belonged to Natalie. Inside were photographs, handwritten letters, newspaper clippings, and one envelope addressed to me. My name was written across the front in my sister's handwriting. I stared at it without touching it. Then, Amelia told me something that made my entire body go cold. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. Natalie had been trying to leave a message behind. And according to Amelia, the last person Natalie had trusted before she disappeared was me. I couldn't bring myself to open the envelope immediately. For 22 years, I had imagined hundreds of possible explanations for what happened to Natalie, but none of them prepared me for seeing her handwriting again. I recognized the shape of every letter almost instantly. Natalie had always written quickly, pressing her pen firmly against the paper whenever she was excited or angry. Even before I opened the envelope, I knew it was hers. And that realization brought back memories I had spent years trying to bury. I looked across the table at Amelia and realized that whatever was inside that envelope might change everything we both believed about the woman we had lost. Amelia watched me carefully as I finally opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter folded several times, along with a small photograph of Natalie holding Amelia as a baby. The photograph was old and slightly faded, but my sister's face was unmistakable. She was smiling directly at the camera, holding her daughter against her chest. I remembered that day. I had taken that photograph myself, standing in the doorway of her bedroom while Natalie complained that I was taking too many pictures. Seeing it again after all those years made my chest tighten. The letter began with my name, followed by words that immediately made me stop breathing for a moment. Natalie explained that she had been afraid for several months before she disappeared. She said she had discovered something about our family that was much bigger than the arguments and secrets I had witnessed growing up. She had found documents suggesting that our father's business had been involved in a financial arrangement that had never been disclosed to the family. More disturbing, she believed someone had been deliberately hiding those records because they could expose people who had spent years protecting their reputations. I read the letter twice because I couldn't process it the first time. Natalie didn't provide every detail, but she repeatedly referred to a set of records she called the blue files. She said those files contained information about payments, property transfers, and agreements involving several people in town. She believed our father had discovered something years earlier and had tried to protect the family from it. According to Natalie, however, he hadn't been the person who started the deception. He had inherited part of the problem from someone who came before him. Amelia leaned forward as I explained what I was reading. She told me that she had already found references to the blue files in another document. That was why she had come to me. She had spent the previous year trying to reconstruct her mother's life before she disappeared, and the more she searched, the more inconsistencies she found. Jonathan had always told her that Natalie had left voluntarily, but when Amelia became an adult, she began asking questions about why her mother had left behind so many personal belongings. Natalie's wedding ring had been found in the house. Her favorite coat was still hanging in the closet. Her passport had never been recovered. Most importantly, several photographs of Amelia were still arranged beside her mother's bed. Those details didn't prove anything by themselves, but they made Amelia question the story she had been told since childhood. Eventually, she started looking through boxes that Jonathan had kept locked away. That's where she found the furniture containing the hidden compartment. Inside that compartment were documents Jonathan had apparently never discovered. Among them was a photograph of a building I immediately recognized. It was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. I hadn't thought about that building in years, but the moment I saw it, I remembered something Natalie had told me shortly before she disappeared. She had mentioned meeting someone there. At the time, I assumed she was referring to a business contact connected to Jonathan. Now, I wondered whether she had been investigating the family records she had mentioned in her letter. Amelia then showed me another photograph. This one had been taken outside the warehouse. Natalie stood beside a man whose face had been partially turned away from the camera. The photograph was dated 6 days before her disappearance. I stared at it for several seconds before recognizing the man's jacket. It belonged to someone I knew. It belonged to our father's former business partner, Harold Mercer. Harold had been one of the most respected businessmen in town. He had worked with my father for more than 20 years and had attended family celebrations when we were growing up. After my father's death, Harold had helped our mother with several financial matters. He had also been one of the people who publicly supported the theory that Natalie had simply left town. I felt sick. if Natalie had been investigating our family and Harold had been meeting her at that warehouse less than a week before she disappeared, then his connection could not be ignored. I told Amelia that we needed to be careful. We couldn't accuse anyone simply because their name appeared in an old photograph. 22 years had passed. Evidence could have disappeared, and memories could be unreliable. But Amelia had clearly done more research than I realized. She had already located public records showing that Harold's company had acquired several properties connected to our father's business shortly after Natalie's disappearance. That wasn't proof of a crime, but it was enough to make me look deeper. We spent the entire afternoon going through the documents together. For the first time in 22 years, I wasn't searching for an explanation alone. Amelia was sitting beside me, asking questions about her mother, and I was finally able to tell her things about Natalie that nobody else could. I told her about the way Natalie used to sing while cooking, how she hated being late, how fiercely protective she was, and how she could never walk past an injured animal without trying to help. Amelia listened to every story as though she were collecting pieces of a mother she had been denied. Then we found something neither of us expected. One of the documents contained a handwritten list of names. There were 7 names on it. Harold Mercer was one. Jonathan was another. And the final name was mine. I stared at my own name for what felt like an eternity. I had never been involved in our father's business. I had never handled the family finances. I had never met anyone at the warehouse. I had spent my entire life believing that I was the one person Natalie trusted. Amelia looked at me with the same confusion I felt. Then she reached into the envelope and pulled out one final piece of paper. It wasn't written by Natalie. It was a copy of a police report from the week she disappeared. At the bottom of the report, someone had added a handwritten note decades after the original investigation had closed. The note contained only one sentence, but it changed the direction of everything. It said that Natalie's disappearance had never been classified as a voluntary departure by the original investigator. Someone had changed the official story afterward. And suddenly, I realized the question was no longer whether Natalie had abandoned us. The question was who had worked so hard to make everyone believe that she had. For the first time in 22 years, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt anger. If the original investigator had never believed Natalie left voluntarily, then someone had deliberately changed the narrative afterward. That meant my family had been living with a false story for more than 2 decades. I had spent years believing that my sister had abandoned her daughter, while someone else had apparently worked behind the scenes to make sure I never questioned what really happened. I looked at Amelia and realized that we had both been robbed of the truth. The handwritten note on the police report had been added by Detective Samuel Carter, the original investigator assigned to Natalie's disappearance. According to the date beside his signature, he had written it only a few months before his retirement. I searched through the rest of the file and found several references to concerns he had raised during the original investigation. He had questioned why Natalie's passport had never been recovered. He had questioned why there were no confirmed sightings of her after the morning she disappeared. Most importantly, he had questioned why Jonathan's account of that morning had changed several times during the first week. I felt a wave of guilt when I read that. I remember Jonathan telling us that Natalie had left after an argument, but I had never known that his story had changed. According to the original police notes, he first claimed Natalie had left before sunrise. Later, he said she had left around 9 in the morning. Then he said they had argued after breakfast and that she had driven away sometime before 10. Those differences had been documented, but somehow they had never become central to the investigation. Amelia was devastated when she learned that her father had been questioned so extensively. She had spent her entire childhood believing Jonathan had been the abandoned parent who raised her alone. She had watched him struggle, listened to him speak about Natalie with bitterness, and accepted his version of events because she had no reason to doubt him. Now she was beginning to wonder whether the father she trusted had known more than he ever admitted. I could see the conflict in her face, and I understood it because I had spent years defending people whose actions I had never truly examined. We decided to find Detective Carter. It took nearly 2 days to locate him. He was living in another state with his daughter and had retired from law enforcement years earlier. When we finally reached him, he agreed to meet us. I expected him to be surprised when he saw me, but his reaction was different. He looked at me for several seconds and then quietly said that he had always wondered whether someone would eventually come looking for answers. That sentence stayed with me. During our meeting, Detective Carter explained that he had never believed Natalie left willingly. He had discovered several details that bothered him from the beginning. Her car had been found with the driver's seat adjusted to a position she normally didn't use. Her purse had been left behind, even though she supposedly planned to leave town. More importantly, a neighbor had reported seeing a dark sedan near the Bennett house that morning. The vehicle belonged to a company connected to Harold Mercer. Carter had tried to investigate the connection, but his supervisor told him to stop pursuing the business angle. He was instructed to treat the case as a voluntary disappearance unless new evidence emerged. Carter didn't agree with the decision, but he had limited authority. He continued making private notes about the case, which explained the handwritten addition to the old report. Then he told us something that neither Amelia nor I expected. The night before Natalie disappeared, she had contacted him. She had told him that she was afraid someone was following her. Carter said Natalie didn't give him the full details because she believed her phone might be monitored. Instead, she arranged to meet him the following week. She intended to provide him with documents connected to our father's business, but she never showed up. I asked Carter why he hadn't told our family about the call. He explained that he had tried. Our father had arrived at the station the following morning and insisted that Natalie was simply going through a difficult period. Jonathan arrived shortly afterward. Both men pressured him in different ways to stop treating the disappearance as suspicious. Carter said there was no direct evidence connecting either man to a crime, but he remembered feeling that they were unusually determined to control the narrative. That information forced me to revisit everything I remembered about my father. I had spent years thinking of him as a strict but loving man. Yet there had always been unexplained tension between him and Natalie. I suddenly remembered one argument I had overheard when I was younger. Natalie had accused him of hiding something about the family business, and my father had become furious. At the time, I thought it was simply another disagreement between a stubborn daughter and a controlling father. Now I wondered whether that argument had been about the same documents Natalie later discovered. Carter gave us copies of his private notes, along with the name of a former accountant who had worked for my father. The accountant, Thomas Reed, was still alive. More importantly, he had apparently kept copies of financial records that had never been included in the official business files. We found Thomas living quietly in a small town several hours away. When we showed him the photograph of the warehouse, his expression immediately changed. He recognized it. He told us that the warehouse had once been used to store company records before they were transferred to another facility. According to him, Harold Mercer had controlled access to the building after my father's death. But the most disturbing information came next. Thomas remembered Natalie visiting him shortly before she disappeared. She had asked him about a series of property transfers involving our father and Harold. Thomas admitted that he had initially refused to speak with her because he was afraid of becoming involved, but Natalie had convinced him that she already knew something was wrong. She told him she had found evidence that money had been moved through several companies and that one of those companies had been created using the identity of a person who had been dead for years. That person was our grandfather. The discovery suggested that someone had been using old family identities to hide financial transactions. But there was still one question I couldn't answer. Why had my name appeared on Natalie's list? Thomas looked at me when I asked him. Then he explained something that made my heart stop. Years earlier, my father had created a separate account in my name without telling me. He had supposedly intended it as protection for me in case something happened to the family business. Thomas said Natalie had discovered that account shortly before she disappeared. She believed the account had been used to move money without my knowledge. I had never known it existed. And suddenly, the mystery wasn't only about what happened to Natalie. It was also about what my father had been hiding from me. We returned home with copies of the records and began examining everything carefully. Amelia found several references to a company that had operated under different names over the years. The company had purchased property, transferred funds, and eventually disappeared. Each time, a different family member or associate appeared somewhere in the paperwork. Then she found something buried inside the last folder, a recent property record. The company connected to the old transactions still existed. It had simply changed its name. And the person listed as its current director was someone neither of us expected. It was Jonathan. Amelia stared at the document in disbelief. Her father wasn't simply connected to the past. He was still involved in the same network Natalie had been investigating 22 years earlier. And suddenly, we understood why someone had worked so hard to keep Natalie's disappearance buried. She hadn't disappeared because she wanted to escape her family. She had disappeared because she had gotten too close to the truth. But there was one final question neither Amelia nor I was prepared to ask. If Jonathan was still connected to the company, what had happened to Natalie after the morning she vanished? The discovery that Jonathan was still connected to the company changed everything. Until that moment, Amelia and I had been searching for answers about the past. But suddenly, the past had walked directly into the present. Jonathan wasn't simply a distant figure from a 22-year-old disappearance. He was alive, accessible, and apparently still connected to the same network Natalie had been investigating before she vanished. I knew we couldn't confront him recklessly. If he had spent years protecting a secret, confronting him without proper evidence could give him another opportunity to destroy records, manipulate witnesses, or create another version of the truth. Amelia and I took everything we had gathered to an attorney named Rebecca Lawson, who specialized in complicated financial and property cases. She spent several days reviewing the old police reports, photographs, business records, letters, and property documents. When she finally finished, she told us there was enough information to justify reopening the investigation. The combination of Natalie's handwritten notes, Detective Carter's private records, the financial documents, and Jonathan's continued connection to the company created a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Rebecca helped us organize everything into a timeline. When we placed the evidence in chronological order, the pattern became disturbing. Natalie had discovered the financial irregularities approximately 6 weeks before she disappeared. She had contacted Thomas Reed shortly afterward. She had photographed the warehouse with Harold Mercer. She had contacted Detective Carter the night before her disappearance. And she had written the letter to me, explaining that she was afraid someone would try to make her disappearance look voluntary. Then we noticed something else. Natalie's investigation had begun shortly after she confronted our mother, Margaret. That discovery forced me to confront one of the most painful memories of my childhood. Margaret had always been the quieter parent. She avoided confrontation and believed family problems should remain inside the family. When Natalie became suspicious about our father's business dealings, Margaret repeatedly told her to stop asking questions. At the time, I had interpreted that as a mother trying to prevent unnecessary conflict between her husband and daughter. Now, I wondered whether Margaret had known more than she admitted. Amelia struggled when she learned this. She had never known her grandmother well enough to understand what kind of person she had been behind closed doors. I explained that Margaret wasn't someone I believed capable of deliberately hurting Natalie, but I also had to admit that my mother's fear of scandal had sometimes made her protect appearances more fiercely than people. That distinction became important because the evidence suggested Margaret had played a role in what happened, but not in the way we initially feared. The police reopened the original case and began interviewing witnesses again. Most people remembered very little after 2 decades, but one former employee at the bus station remembered something unusual. She recalled seeing a young woman matching Natalie's description with an infant on the morning Natalie disappeared. The woman had been carrying a small suitcase and appeared to be waiting for someone. She wasn't alone for long. A man arrived shortly afterward, and the two appeared to have a heated conversation. The employee couldn't identify the man with certainty, but she remembered his dark jacket and the vehicle he was driving. Investigators compared the description with old records and discovered that the vehicle had been registered to a company associated with Harold Mercer. That information changed the investigation. Natalie hadn't simply left the house. She had apparently tried to leave town with Amelia, and someone had intercepted her. The police then obtained archived records from the bus company. There had been a ticket purchased under a false name that morning, but it had never been used. The destination was another state, and the ticket had been canceled shortly after it was purchased. That suggested Natalie had planned to leave, but had been prevented from doing so. Amelia became emotional when she heard that. For 22 years, she had believed her mother had willingly walked away from her. Now she was learning that her mother had apparently tried to take her somewhere safe. She spent that evening looking through the photographs she had inherited, searching for anything that might reveal where Natalie had intended to go. Eventually, she found a small handwritten address on the back of an old photograph. It belonged to a woman named Clara Whitmore. Rebecca traced Clara through old professional records and discovered that she had worked as a nurse at a private medical facility outside town. More importantly, Clara had left her position shortly after Natalie's disappearance. We eventually located her, and after some hesitation, she agreed to meet us. Clara was elderly by then, but her memory of Natalie was remarkably clear. She told us that Natalie had contacted her shortly before she disappeared because she was frightened. Natalie had asked whether Clara could help her and Amelia leave town safely. Clara agreed to provide temporary shelter, but Natalie never arrived. Then, Clara revealed something that made my heart pound. She had received a phone call from Natalie on the morning she disappeared. Natalie had sounded terrified. She told Clara that someone had discovered her plans and that she couldn't come. Clara had asked where she was, but Natalie refused to say because she believed the person listening might be able to trace her location. Before ending the call, Natalie told Clara that if anything happened to her, she needed to remember one thing. Natalie had said that people believed Victoria knew nothing. I immediately understood what she meant. Natalie had been talking about me. She had believed that I was being kept in the dark deliberately. She knew I had nothing to do with the financial scheme, and she suspected that whoever was protecting it would eventually try to use my name or reputation to make their actions harder to trace. But there was another person Natalie had been worried about. Our mother, Margaret. Clara explained that Natalie had mentioned Margaret during the conversation. Natalie believed our mother knew that something was wrong with the family business, But she didn't think Margaret understood how serious the situation had become. Margaret had been frightened that exposing the truth would destroy our family, so she had repeatedly begged Natalie to stop investigating. That was the heartbreaking part. Margaret had not deliberately betrayed Natalie. She had made a terrible mistake by trusting the wrong people. According to Clara, Natalie believed Margaret had told Jonathan and Harold about some of her questions because she was desperate for someone to convince Natalie to stop. Margaret apparently thought they would simply confront Natalie and discourage her from continuing. She never imagined that the information would put her daughter in danger. I remembered my mother constantly telling Natalie that some things were better left alone. At the time, I thought Margaret was simply trying to protect the family from embarrassment. Now I realized she had unknowingly given Jonathan information that allowed him to track Natalie's investigation. That distinction didn't erase Margaret's responsibility, but it changed how I understood her role. She hadn't planned Natalie's disappearance. She had unknowingly helped the people who did.
The investigation eventually focused heavily on Jonathan and Harold Mercer. Harold had died several years earlier, but his business records provided crucial evidence. Several documents showed that money had been transferred through companies connected to Jonathan. Investigators also discovered that some property records had been altered shortly after Natalie disappeared. Then came the breakthrough. A storage facility connected to Harold's former company contained several boxes that had never been opened after his death. Inside one of those boxes were old business records, photographs, and a cassette tape. The tape had been recorded 22 years earlier. Natalie's voice was on it. She explained what she had discovered. She described the financial scheme, the falsified property records, and the pressure she had received to remain silent. She also explained that Jonathan knew about the scheme and had helped conceal parts of it. Then she revealed something even more disturbing.
Natalie said she had realized that someone was telling Jonathan what she was investigating. Someone had been reporting her movements. Someone had been giving him information. But according to Natalie's recording, that person wasn't Victoria. It was Margaret. Not because Margaret wanted Natalie harmed, but because Margaret had been frightened and believed that Jonathan could persuade Natalie to stop digging. Margaret had trusted her son-in-law more than she should have. She had told him about Natalie's concerns because she wanted the family conflict to end. Instead, Jonathan used that information against Natalie. The recording also revealed that Natalie had confronted Jonathan after realizing what he was doing. She had told him she was going to the police. That was apparently when the situation became dangerous.
Investigators eventually reconstructed the morning of Natalie's disappearance using the witness statements, financial records, and newly discovered evidence. Jonathan had confronted Natalie at home and tried to convince her to leave town without Amelia. Natalie refused. She intended to take her daughter and expose what she had discovered. She never made it out of town. Evidence suggested Jonathan forced Natalie into another vehicle and took her to a property connected to Harold's company. From there, the trail became complicated, but the investigation uncovered enough evidence to establish that her disappearance had not been voluntary. Jonathan was eventually arrested. But there was still one question that haunted Amelia and me. What had happened to Natalie after she disappeared? The answer came from evidence investigators discovered in an old medical facility. A woman had been treated there under another name years earlier. The records were incomplete, but photographs and fingerprints eventually confirmed her identity. It was Natalie. She had survived. She had escaped months after her disappearance and had spent years living under another identity because she was terrified that Jonathan would find her. She had tried to stay away because she believed returning would put Amelia in danger. She had watched from a distance when she could, but she never believed it was safe enough to reveal herself. Until now. When Amelia and I finally saw her, I couldn't move. 22 years disappeared in a single moment. Natalie looked older, of course. Her hair had changed. Her face carried the weight of years I couldn't imagine. But the moment she looked at me, I recognized my sister. Amelia reached her first. The two of them embraced for what felt like an eternity. Then Natalie looked at me. She began crying before I even reached her. I wrapped my arms around my sister, and for the first time in 22 years, I wasn't holding on to a memory of Natalie. I was holding Natalie. She later explained that she had never stopped loving Amelia. She had never abandoned her daughter. Every year, every birthday, every milestone she missed had been a wound she carried with her. She had stayed away because she believed that if Jonathan discovered she was alive, he might come after Amelia. The truth didn't restore the years we had lost. It couldn't give Amelia back her childhood with her mother. It couldn't erase the fear Natalie had lived with or the guilt Margaret had carried until her death. It couldn't undo the lies that had shaped our family for more than 2 decades. But it gave us something we had been denied: the truth. And as I sat beside Natalie and Amelia, I finally understood something I had never understood when Natalie disappeared. Sometimes, betrayal isn't committed by one person alone. Sometimes one person lies, another stays silent, another believes the wrong person, and an entire family ends up living inside a story that was never true. Our mother, Margaret, had made a terrible mistake. Jonathan had deliberately exploited that mistake. Harold had helped protect the scheme, and Natalie had paid the highest price. But the truth had finally found its way back to us. For 22 years, I had believed my sister had abandoned our family. Now, I knew she had been fighting to protect it. And perhaps the most painful part of all was realizing that she had never stopped trying to come home. There are some stories that stay with you long after the final truth has been revealed, and Natalie's story is one of them. For 22 years, I believed my sister had walked away from the people who loved her. I carried that belief through adulthood, through marriage, through raising my own family, and through the deaths of our parents. I had convinced myself that perhaps I had simply failed to understand her all those years ago. But standing beside her again taught me something I will never forget. Sometimes the person you believe abandoned you is actually the person who was fighting the hardest to protect you. What happened to Natalie changed Amelia's life forever. She finally got the opportunity to know the mother she had spent her entire childhood missing. They had years of conversations to catch up on, photographs to look through, memories to create, and painful questions to answer. Nothing could replace the childhood they had lost, but they refused to allow the past to steal the rest of their lives. Their relationship wasn't rebuilt overnight. There were difficult conversations, anger, tears, and moments when Amelia struggled to understand why her mother had stayed away for so long. But slowly, they began building something neither of them had ever been given the chance to have. Jonathan eventually faced the consequences of what he had done. The evidence recovered from the old business records, the testimony from witnesses, Detective Carter's original notes, and Natalie's recording created a case that could no longer be buried. His involvement in the financial scheme and his role in concealing information about Natalie's disappearance were finally exposed. For years, he had relied on the assumption that enough time had passed for the truth to disappear. He had believed that people would eventually stop asking questions. What he never understood was that time doesn't destroy the truth.
Sometimes it simply gives the truth more places to hide until someone finally finds it.
Harold Mercer never lived long enough to answer for his role. That was difficult for me to accept because part of me wanted every person responsible to stand before us and explain themselves. I wanted to hear why they had chosen money, reputation, and fear over human lives. I wanted to know how they could watch our family suffer while continuing to protect themselves. But life doesn't always provide the kind of justice we imagine. Sometimes the people who caused the damage are gone before the truth arrives. That doesn't mean their actions disappear. Their names remain attached to the evidence, and the people they hurt continue carrying the consequences. As for my mother, Margaret, I eventually came to understand her differently. I still wish she had asked more questions. I wish she had believed Natalie sooner. I wish she had realized that protecting the family's reputation was never worth sacrificing her daughter's safety. But I also learned that fear can make ordinary people make extraordinary mistakes. Margaret never intended for Natalie to disappear. She never imagined that the information she shared would be used against her daughter. Her mistake was trusting the wrong people and believing that silence could keep a family together. Instead, that silence allowed the people causing the damage to become more powerful. For me, forgiveness became the hardest part of everything. I had to decide whether forgiving my mother meant excusing what happened. Eventually, I realized that forgiveness and accountability are not the same thing. I could acknowledge the terrible consequences of Margaret's decisions without pretending those decisions hadn't mattered. I could love my mother while still admitting that she had been wrong. And I could welcome Natalie back into my life without pretending that 22 years of separation hadn't left scars that would take time to heal. I also learned something about secrets that I wish I had understood when I was younger. Families sometimes convince themselves that keeping painful information hidden is an act of protection. They tell themselves that children are too young to understand, that the truth would cause unnecessary pain, or that silence will eventually make the problem disappear. But secrets rarely disappear. They move from one generation to another, changing shape as they go. Eventually, someone discovers the truth, and when that happens, the damage caused by the secret can be greater than the damage the truth would have caused in the first place. Amelia once asked me whether I thought Natalie should have told me everything before she disappeared. I thought about that question for a long time. Part of me wanted to say yes, because perhaps things could have been different if she had trusted me with everything she knew. But I eventually realized that Natalie had been trying to protect me. She knew I wasn't prepared for what she had discovered, and she knew that the people around her were becoming dangerous. She had kept me outside the investigation because she believed that ignorance might keep me safe. She wasn't pushing me away. She was trying to protect the person she loved. If there is one thing I would want someone listening to this story to understand, it is that trust should never mean refusing to question what doesn't make sense. You can love your family and still ask difficult questions. You can respect someone and still recognize when their actions don't match their words. You can forgive someone without giving them permission to hurt you again. And most importantly, you should never allow fear of conflict to convince you that silence is always the safer choice. Because sometimes silence protects the wrong person. Sometimes the truth hurts for a moment, while a lie can destroy generations. And sometimes the person everyone has accused of leaving is actually the person who has been waiting all along for someone to finally look closely enough to find them. So now I want to ask you something. If you were in my position and you discovered after 22 years that the person you believed had abandoned your family
had actually been fighting to protect you, would you be able to forgive the people who helped hide the truth from you? Would you forgive someone like Margaret for making a terrible mistake because she was afraid? Or would you believe that some betrayals are simply too painful to forgive? I genuinely want to know what you would do, so tell me your answer in the comments. And if this story made you think about someone in your own life whose side of the story was never heard, take a moment to remember that person. Sometimes there are people carrying painful truths because they believe nobody will listen to them. Sometimes asking one honest question can uncover something that has been hidden for years.
If you enjoyed this story, please like this video. Share it with someone who loves emotional stories about family, trust, betrayal, and unexpected truth. And subscribe to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal so you don't miss our next story. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these stories to life, and I truly appreciate every person who takes the time to listen. Thank you for listening.